God, I could totally Alice this right now down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to stop myself right here because I'm really like, I'm like clawing up the dirt.
I can see you like just like hanging over the edge of the hole. Like, ooh, what's down there?
Like I'm like holding my pop screen just so I don't fall down.
Right, I got you.
My dress over my head, trying to eat cookies and grow big, you know.
Hello, and welcome to Well Shit. It really is that simple. I'm Claire.
And I'm Serena. On this podcast, we help you to understand about your 12 universal needs, why they are currently not being well met,
how to meet them in ways that work for you, and how to consistently do so in quick, easy, and simple ways that fit seamlessly into your life.
We'll also help you to understand how doing so will have a positive ripple effect in literally every area of your life.
If you like what you hear, come and join the conversation in our Facebook group.
And enjoy the show.
Hello.
Hey, everyone. Today we are on episode 3 of our trauma series. We have talked about what is trauma, how to identify trauma, and now we're going to be on to the big one, how to heal trauma and its triggers.
Yeah, that's a big. This is what everybody really wants. This is the point. This is the episode everyone's been looking for. But it's a little bit like the needs work in a lot of ways. Like when someone comes and works with us doing the needs stuff, a lot of the time they want the mentoring. They want here's the thing that's going on in your life and it's this need, and here's how you address it. The problem is, in order to get to that bit, you need the information up front so that bit makes sense. And it's kind of the same thing with the trauma series, which is like, tell me how to heal the trauma. Yeah, but you have to understand this piece of information before we get to that point.
Right. I mean, I'm having some lingual issues right now. In the last episode, I told you of the example like that happened to me the other day, which is, you know, I didn't realize I hadn't identified it as a traumatic situation. So until I identified it, I couldn't take the proper steps to heal it because I've been doing.
Well, you wouldn't have been healing it. You'd have been like coping with it. You'd be avoiding it. You'd be minimizing it or downplaying it, or like it's
all of those things.
Navigating around it rather than actually healing it. And it's funny. I remember having a friend of mine said to me many years ago. I mean, this whole thing started off with a sentence that I couldn't have disagreed more with if I tried. And I can't remember exactly how she phrased it. It was something like, "You're the most evolved person I've ever met." And I was like, whoa. I'm like, for a start, there's no better or worse when it comes to evolution. We're all just where we are on our journey. 2, I don't believe that to be true. 3, what the hell? Where is this coming from? And she said to me, "You're the only person I know who, when you see heartbreak on the horizon, you walk towards it rather than away from it." And I said to her, I was like, because if that heartbreak, which is a trauma, if that heartbreak is a part of my future, then I'd rather just deal with it now. I'd rather just go through the process, experience it and heal from it so that we can be done and dusted with this shit as quickly as possible, rather than dance around it for the next 6 months, year, 2 years or whatever.
Lifetime.
I mean, that's what a lot of people do. We dance around our traumas and like, oh, I don't like,
what? Sorry. I just had one of those moments where like something from my childhood came back to me. And I think we've talked, if not, we certainly will. My relationship with my father was different.
Interesting.
Yeah. Different. And one of my very, very close family friends was like, "Oh, that's just your dance." And now I'm like, oh, wow, that was the trauma. That was the trauma dance. And it's like, and yeah, there's so many people you have this dance with in your life. And if you have to dance with somebody, chances are you're dancing around a little trauma dog.
Well, and
it's not always.
It can be with people, it can be with situations, but I think that's like, it doesn't go away. It doesn't stop being true just because we're not dealing with it. And in fact, the longer we don't deal with it, the more it's going to affect us. And that's the reason I'm like, oh, all in, let's do this shit.
Over and done with.
It's all going to be fun. but it's going to be much better than if I don't do it and avoid it and like play around the side. So yeah, this is the important part of this process, but you need to understand these other pieces first. So one of the things that's important, and we talk about this in episode number 51, which is how to cultivate resilience or how to build resilience, one of the two. We talk about the fact that effective trauma healing is basically how you cultivate resilience. So it didn't feel right to do a trauma episode without at least mentioning the resilience thing. Because as we talked about, I think I mentioned it in the last episode, any situation which negatively impacts our needs is a trauma. And the extent to which how quickly and effectively we can heal the impact to our needs and return them to the place they were in before the trauma happened is that's our resilience. Like how quickly and effectively we can do that, it shows the level of resilience that we have. If it takes us a little bit longer, obviously there's less resilience there than if we're able to kind of do it instantaneously. And the example, I mean, I've used this example don't know how many times, and I don't know how many times more I will use it, but it's the same as the Star Trek shields example. Like if our shields are up, then it means that we are less able to be impacted by the things around us because our shields are at 100%. And if our shields get hit, it's the extent to which our resilience is the extent to which we can build them back up to where they were before we were hit. So if they were at 100% and they've gone down to 50, our resilience is how fast and effectively we can get our shields back up to 100% again. And the way that we do that is is by identifying what are the needs that have been impacted and how do we basically meet those needs so that it addresses the negative impact to them by having a positive impact to them by meeting them. And the thing is that our resilience is dependent on a number of different factors. Because it is the extent to which we can recover our needs, you need to know your needs well enough to know what's been impacted. Mm-hmm. Like, it's one of the things that we were talking in the last episode about a situation that Serena had before she went through the needs work. And the thing is, her ability to address that situation when it happened was compromised because she didn't even know what her needs were to be able to go, well, it was this one, and this mm-hmm. one. She just went, shitty situation, because in the absence of knowing the specifics, that's basically as far as we go. The second thing that is a kind of big piece here is like we also need to know our needs well enough to know how to meet them in order to return them to that pre-impacted state. Like we can know what the need is, but if we don't know the ways of meeting that need that work for us, how do we get it back to that return state? It was like, well, any ideas, anyone? Like,
right?
Anybody? I've got this need. It's been impacted.
Does anybody teach this?
Yeah. No one. Mr. Niggles? No.
Where is?
Oh, he must be having a nap. Oh, he's right in front of you.
Right in front.
Mr. Niggles, if you haven't already found out, is the name of our Niggle monster from our Clearing Niggles episode. It's part of the friendship series. No, Mr. Niggles doesn't know anyone either.
He's the strong silent type.
Until he's not silent, in which case he can be a little annoying. Especially when he's right up on the microphone.
Yeah, I put him down before we could get to that point.
Oh, dear.
You're welcome.
So we need to know what our needs are. We need to know how we can meet our needs. But we also need to find ways, we need to know ways of meeting needs that aren't dependent on others or aren't dependent on specific situations. It's like, if it's like, I can meet my need, but only when the moon is full and it's in the second quarter of the year and I'm balancing on one leg and everybody on the planet is in perfect harmony and that, like, yeah, no.
Don't forget the glittery top hat.
And with the glittery top hat.
I mean, that definitely solidifies that process.
Finishes everything off completely.
On a Tuesday.
On a Tuesday afternoon.
Leap year. Only leap year.
I mean, and how's it the second half of the year if it's a leap year? Oh,
who the fuck?
Oh, it's
knows?
on a leap year. No, not in February. Not on a leap year. Anyway, yeah.
This is why this is not a good idea. But and as ridiculous as it sounds, sometimes we're jumping through hoops for something that can be a lot quicker, a lot simpler. Easier, a lot simpler. And that's why we are here. That's why this podcast is here, because, well, shit. It really is that simple. And it has nothing to do with the moon, your top hat, or what foot you're standing on.
So we don't want it to be dependent on other people, because we can't control whether when that happens, how it happens, how much it happens. We don't want it to be specific situations, because our ability to create that specific situation is going to be harder than if it can happen in any situation. We also want things that are going to be quick and easy for us to do. So we can do it quickly and easy because we want it to be quick and effective. That's one of the things that increases our resilience. And so we want things that aren't going to take too long, because if I've got this thing to meet my need, which takes me an hour, that's going to mean it's going to take me at least an hour to build my resilience, to engage the resilience to get back to that pre-impacted state.
And I'm going to...
If it takes 30 seconds, it means it's only going to be like my resilience is only going to take 30 seconds to kick in. That's all I was going to say. Go ahead.
I try to wait for that pause. Here.
My turn.
Another thing I want to add to this, this part of knowing the ways of meeting your needs that are quick, that aren't dependent on other people, and that don't take too long, is also knowing the different options. Because I can have a go-to thing. Like, I know certain things, like, it's like if I'm feeling this way, like, this usually works for me. And 99.9% of times, like, deep breathing could work for me for something. And then there's that 0.01% where that could actually be detrimental to me or just not effective. So knowing the different options of how to meet each need. And that's why, you know, when we get into the program, we have our needs menu and having all these things, because something that you don't even think of, it's like, oh, that would feel so good right now. And having that kind of tool belt of different options.
Well, and the other thing is like is that we talked about it in the last episode, I think it was, that there are certain situations where you can't do certain things or it's not easy to. It's like if I want to feel grounded by it, I want to meet my security need by lying on the floor, and I'm in the middle of, like, if I was in the middle of a presentation, like we've got a TED Talk planned. If I'm in the middle of my TED Talk, I'm probably not just going to lay down on the stage in the middle of my TED Talk to meet my needs. I've only got 18 minutes, and you've seen how long our podcasts are. I mean, let's be honest, I'm going to need every second of that time.
I mean, actually,
I might actually do it.
I was going to say that,
but
contextually,
if I was in a meeting with a high-end client or a corporate client, which there are different kind of social norms in those situations, it might not be something that I would do. I might find a different way of doing it, because it's going to create less disconnect in the connection, rapport, communication that we're having at that time. Like, certain situations I will be like, oh, I would normally do it this way, I'm not going to do it this way right now, because this situation will be supported better by my doing it this way than it would be if I did it this way. And that's basically what we're getting at. So also, I know this is a big thing for you, like how resourced we are beforehand can affect this massively, right?
Absolutely. Our capacity to respond to trauma is dependent on our level of resource. As Claire was saying with the Star Trek shields, if your shield is at 10% and you take a hit, well, fuck, there it goes. But if you're already at 100, you take that hit and you're like, all right, well, I felt that 5% up. Okay, take a hit. Like, the more resourced you are, not that you want to keep taking hits without resourcing in the middle, but life, adulting, like, sometimes it feels like an avalanche. And as we said, they're the slight, the significant, the severe traumas. We're constantly being impacted by these things. So we may be focusing on, oh, this big trauma took out 10% of our shields, but we're not even conscious of the fact that, you know, there's 5% here, 2% here, another 10% here. So the more resourced we are in general, the easier it's going to be for us to actually respond effectively to our trauma and its healing.
Yeah. And it's important to recognize that capacity is both at the moment that we experience the trauma. So if we are effectively meeting our needs consistently, we're going to be in a better state than we would be if we weren't. So, like, that resource because we don't know when those are going to happen. Very rarely do we know when they're going to happen. Because a lot of the time, if we know they're coming, we're going to avoid them. We're going to find something else.
Oh, I see you.
Bye. And so, but also, we want to make sure we're resourced when we are doing trauma healing. Like, the more resourced we are, if you go in depleted to doing trauma healing, it's going to probably take longer. It's going to take more of a toll on you. It's going to require more energy than it would be if you actually built your resources before going into that situation. So yes, you'll be able to respond better in the moment if you're better resourced. but it's important to make sure that we are taking care of our needs and resourcing us before we go into healing trauma, because sometimes part of healing trauma is revisiting it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we need to revisit it to figure out what needs a compromise. Sometimes we need to revisit it in order to feel it, to process the emotional experience expression part of the need. There's a bunch of different things here, and we want to be in the best resource state to be able to do this. Now, it's important to say at this point, we shouldn't need to be resilient. I'm going to say that again. We shouldn't need to be resilient. We shouldn't be living in a society where simply living and existing creates regular traumas. And even more so, the more, if you're marginalized, if you sit at the intersections of multiple marginalizations, like the level of trauma and the consistency and the frequency at which they are experiencing trauma is just, there is no word that can do justice to that. Mm-hmm. It is horrific. It is unacceptable. It is not the way that life should be.
And for many people, it's constant.
Absolutely. Like it, in so many ways. Mm-hmm. So knowing how to cultivate resilience doesn't negate the need for change at an internal level, in terms of like, are we doing things that are putting us into situations where we're experiencing more trauma by, for example, or are we not doing things that would prevent that? So are we not setting boundaries? Like that's an internal thing that we can do that can help to mitigate some of the impact or minimize some of the impact to us. It doesn't negate the need for change interpersonally, to make sure that in our relationships that things are changing in such a way that we are not experiencing consistent impacts. It doesn't negate the need for change at a systemic level in our culture, in our society, to stop the traumas from happening in the first place. None of this negates that. All it means is we are better equipped to cope in the meantime while that change is taking place. And sometimes we're better resourced to actually instigate that change. Like a lot of the time, if we're in a shitty relationship and we are we're depleted because we're just taking hit upon hit upon hit upon hit upon hit upon hit, our resources are so low we don't have the capacity to address it. And sometimes by allowing ourselves to engage with that resilience and heal from the impacts, we actually can do something about it by setting boundaries, by saying no, by leaving the situation. That takes energy in order to do that. So it's really important to recognize that we shouldn't have to be as resilient as we need to be existing in our society these days.
Very true.
So
now we're going to get to why you're probably here.
Why do you think they're here? Is there something they want to know?
I don't know. I mean, got the what is trauma?
Uh-huh.
How to identify it within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Third piece, healing.
Yay! Let's get into it. So, you want to kind of start off with this?
Yeah. So we're going to go back to the basic building blocks of this series, and because all trauma is rooted in our needs being unmet, all trauma healing involves the effective meeting of those needs. There is a direct correlation into that.
Say that again.
Yep, I would say that again. I got this out of my head. So again, because all trauma is rooted in our needs being unmet, all trauma healing involves the effective meeting of those needs.
Yes.
Like I
leave a space for that to land,
and really repeat it to yourself. It seems so simple, but even reading it now, I'm like, yep.
Yes.
Yep. Go back to what needs were compromised. Okay, now I can meet those needs, and the healing begins.
Absolutely. So there are several steps to the healing process.
It's not just one and done. Damn.
I mean, not right now. If we can come up with it in the future, I'll be really impressed.
Future goals.
Yay. Hashtag universal need goals. No, there are a few steps to the process in order that we can do it effectively. Because that's the thing, is that we want the healing to be effective. Like so often we try and shortcut our way through the process, or we try and like speed our way through the process. But the key thing here is going deep with it. The deeper we can go with it, the more completely and more fully we're going to heal it.
And I want to say, in those moments when you're going deep, especially when you first start going deep with trauma, it's scary, it's uncomfortable. There's a lot of feels that most of us try to avoid as a general rule. And as somebody who continuously dives into it, it's like, all right, where is this coming from? It gets easier the more that you do it. Like, you're like, okay, I'm feeling this. Okay, the fact that I'm feeling this means I'm getting in there. Is there more? Is there more? And it lets you dig deeper. But as Claire said, like, that's where the real healing is. Like, if you're doing it at a surface level, you might get surface healing. The deeper in the different layers, like every layer you can unfold that is a layer to that trauma, that is going to be a more a deeper and more thank you, that's the word I was looking for, comprehensive healing process.
Well, if you imagine that the trauma is like the trauma involved in like breaking your arm, but there was like a flesh wound as well. If you imagine that all you do is focus on healing the skin, well, yeah, there's healing there, but you've not addressed the deeper thing that needs to be healed, which is the bone. Like, you have to heal the bone in order that everything functions as well. If we just focus on the surface, we have to go into, like, sometimes when you break a bone, they have to put it back into alignment again, like in order for it to heal. You could just leave it and it might heal, but it might not heal the way you want. You have to look at it at the deepest point at which the trauma has impacted in order to effectively heal it. Now, it is important to say within this, a couple of important things. The first thing is, if you have not done this work before, I highly, 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 highly recommend. I recommend that you seek out some kind of professional support and guidance through this process, because it can be really challenging. And to do it with support by somebody who knows what they are doing, it will dramatically impact your feeling, because you can feel like you're being... someone's holding the container for you to do this healing. So you're not feeling like kind of vulnerable or as vulnerable as you would otherwise. The second thing is that sometimes trauma healing happens in layers. So sometimes, like, it's not like you have to go in and be like, oh, that's the deepest part, let's dig that out first. Sometimes we have to address the layers on the surface, and when we address the things on the surface, they open up the doors of, it's a gateway to, oh, hold on a second, there's something more underneath. It's your trauma healing journey is your trauma healing journey. There is no right way of doing it. There is no way it is meant to look. It is meant to look whichever way is right for you, for your capacity, for the support that you have. And I cannot express this strongly enough. If you are able to, if you can, get some support with this process, because as somebody who teaches about this, I have someone I go to. Like, I don't try and do this on my own. Sometimes I do with some of the more slight or significant traumas, but if I'm dealing with severe trauma, I go to someone who can help me guide through that process. Because even if I know what to do, having somebody hold the space and hold the container while I am doing that, and if I get to a point where when we're in our trauma, when we're in our healing process, sometimes we might be like, oh, okay, I feel a little bit stuck right now, I'm not really sure where to go from here. Somebody else there to support you with, like, okay, how about this? Like, look at this, try this way, just like that can help guide you through that. There are no words for how valuable that can be and how much of a difference it can make. Also, when you're being witnessed in this process, sometimes it can open up a deeper layer. There is something about being witnessed by somebody else when you are doing this. Like, I know this is a really weird example, but I was literally thinking about this morning. Totally unrelated. If you're watching like a stand-up comedy, like if I'm watching stand-up comedy and I'm watching by myself, it has to be a really funny joke for me to laugh out loud, like really funny. And a lot of the time I'll see it as amusing and I'll have a little smile and what have you. If I'm with somebody, there is something about that process of doing it with somebody that I laugh out loud more. There's this and I think there's a little bit like, I don't think it's the same thing. I think that's more about it being a shared experience, but there is something about being witnessed in this that allows you to access deeper, and it allows you to to go more into the richness of it and the depth of it.
And the real, like, I think being witness, like with my example from the last episode, like it all kind of happened in the midst of a conversation. But if I had just realized that I was part of a traumatic event on my own, like having somebody there witnessing that, it was like I felt it at a deeper level. I'm like, oh, and I'm saying it to somebody, and I didn't want that person to fix it.
Right.
I didn't want them to even touch it. Like, but it was just having them there.
Well, it's part of the acknowledgement need. Like part of the acknowledgement need. Witnessing is part of the acknowledgement need. I'm just suddenly realized we need to add that to the slides because I don't think it's in there. I mean, witnessing is like, obviously the primary thing we want to do with our needs is we want to learn how to meet them for ourselves. And being witnessed by somebody else, there is something about having somebody else know it to be true that acknowledges it. It's outside of our internal bubble. So yes, we can acknowledge it for ourselves, and that is really important. That's our first step. That's our baseline. And if we can have somebody, especially somebody who is a professional, who understands how to respond effectively and in a way that is not going to cause further trauma and is not going to inhibit the process, but actually support it, to be witnessed and acknowledged in that it takes it gives it greater depth. It gives it a greater weight, because it's not just being acknowledged by me, it's being acknowledged by something outside of myself as well. So that is, as I said, primary focus with needs is us first. How do we meet this for ourselves? And it's very important to recognize that this is part of the reason that one of the things that we can do for ourselves to meet this need is to get the help of a professional who can witness us effectively. We're still doing that. We're the one who's had to go and find the professional and accept help and book the appointment and all these sorts of things. That's something that still we're doing. We're just using that professional as a resource to help us to create a deeper level of healing within that. Didn't expect that to come out or to go in there, but hey,
there it is.
Here we are. Okay, so,
and actually, while you're there, I'm just gonna mention this. Please correct me.
I was about to go on into the healing steps then, but no, we're taking a little tangent first.
And please correct me if there is nuance here that I'm not immediately identifying. Like, and when we say like being witnessed in general has its own healing component, but
can.
And that's kind of where I'm going with this is we're talking about going to a professional. Like in my example, I was in the situation. I was not speaking with a professional, especially in this realm. However, it's how it happened. However, if I had taken that situation out and gone to one of my friends who knows nothing about trauma, nothing about needs, that kind of thing, they could have put their own lens on it and their own spin. So like when we're saying somebody who is a professional, like that, we're not just saying anybody. Like I said, that it can be beneficial to be witnessed by others. However, I want to make it really clear, like especially with trauma, like speak to somebody who knows. Trained.
Yeah, who knows what they're doing as far as this is concerned. Because you're right. I think that it was luck more than anything that meant that when you were witnessed yesterday in the conversation, or whenever it was the day before in the conversation that you had, that it was that the response did not negatively impact or further traumatize you.
And I think that's luck because of the work we do, what we teach. I mean, we're here doing this podcast, and like my go-to person is a professional. I'm very lucky in that sense.
Yeah, but what I mean is, I don't think that's the reason that it was luck in that situation. I just think you were lucky in that moment that how that person responded allowed you to feel, oh, okay, I've just been witnessed in this. I think probably because of their own shock. They didn't really know what else to say. So they were just like, oh, you've never said that before, which in and of itself was being witnessed. I think the inability to know what else to say prevented them from saying more. And if they said more, they probably could have dug a hole for themselves and ended up shoving you into it in like accidentally because of how they responded to it, because a lot of people don't respond well to this. So it is really important to make sure that you have the people that you are witnessing you, or that you have someone who you know and can trust and can say to them, I just need to be witnessed right now. Please do not fix. Please do not da 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 da. And even then, sometimes there can be there can be an energetic shift where you kind of feel something shift in them, and it's like, oh, that doesn't feel good. Like, you want somebody who has the ability to be present with your trauma without, I mean, we talked about it in the How to Hold Space for Somebody episode, without withdrawing or without collapsing into it. And that is the best person. Now, not everybody can afford that, not everybody has access to that, so there may be other things that might be within that, closer to that scope within the people that you know, but wherever possible. I think this is the thing, is that we recognize there's a huge amount of privilege in what we're saying, because not everybody has access, not everybody can afford it. And if you can, that is something that would be incredibly helpful for you with doing this. So what are the steps? So the first step in the trauma healing process is really something that is not a conscious thing, generally speaking. There might be some consciousness in it. The first step is just cope with the trauma. Like, in the moment, it's that short-term, immediate coping strategy by subconsciously taking care of our most present needs. So we think about, how do you identify that you're in a trauma? Like the heart racing, the shallow breathing, the fast breathing. Like, one of the most important things is just to start deep breaths. It's like, what do I need to do? Because remember, when you're in the trauma, you are not necessarily going to be logically thinking. So you can't think about the steps of healing trauma when you're in that reactionary trauma response in the moment. Now, afterwards, you can do more to heal the trauma so that it might lessen the trauma response. It might shorten the trauma response going forward in the future. But when you're actually in it, you just got to cope with the fact that you're in it, in that, for the moment that you're in that intensity of it. So it might be just taking some deep breaths, like grounding yourself, like Serena said. Like, the second you kind of notice, hold on, something's going on right now, deep breaths is always the first place I start. Just take some deep belly breaths and feel the support of whatever is underneath you in that moment. And even if that's all you do, just to focus on, in order to get to the point where your brain kind of kicks in again and you're able to logically think, it may be that actually that the flight is what you need. You have to get out of the situation, and actually you need to follow that. And chances are, even once floored, after you've run away, that you may still be in the trauma response. So again, breathing, grounding yourself, like doing whatever you can. Like, it's the second you notice that something doesn't feel quite right, take some deep breaths and try and support yourself in getting to the point where your brain can start to logically function again. Because trying to do anything around trauma healing when you're not in that space, you're not going to be able to guide yourself through the steps effectively. So the first thing is just cope until you're on the other side of that immediate trauma response. Second thing is, as Serena identified yesterday, naming the trauma, naming the fact that it was a trauma. Now, you don't necessarily need to know whether it was a slight or a significant. You can name it as that. But it's like, that was traumatic for me. That was a traumatic incident. That negatively impacted my needs, either through a situation or somebody that was outside. They directly impacted my needs. Naming that is part of it. As we said, the acknowledgement need, it's already meeting that acknowledgement need for yourself, because you're going, I am acknowledging this is what happened to me. And therefore, that's part of the part of meeting those needs, is acknowledging this is what happened to me. Because until you acknowledge it, that acknowledgement need is not being met. The other thing is, you need to name it as a trauma in order to start to heal it as a trauma, because you need to know, this is what I'm dealing with. As I said, it's like if you had a broken bone, but you're
slapping a Band-Aid on it.
Well, no, you're trying to heal appendicitis. Like, probably not going to come up with a good healing strategy. Like, you need to know what it is you're trying to heal in order to effectively try and heal it. That's the next step. The next step is processing the trauma itself. Now, this is like not when you're actually in the trauma response, but processing the fact that the trauma had to you. So the thing is that every trauma, I can't think of an exception. So I'm going to say every right now. I may revise this later. Every trauma is going to have some kind of emotional experience and expression component. Like, you're going to feel some kind of way about it. You might feel sad. You might feel disappointed. You might feel angry. You might feel frustrated. it's important to actually process that feeling. Like, it's okay that you feel the way that you are. And the other thing is your acknowledgement need. So that acknowledging, like, naming the trauma is the first thing, obviously, is part of that acknowledgement need. The second thing is empathizing with yourself. Like, it's okay that I feel the way that I feel about this thing that happened to me. Like, that empathy, that self-empathy, having that compassion for yourself, and allowing yourself to feel the feels that come up as a result of the trauma are part of the process. You've got to process that. It might not be comfortable, but believe you me, it is far more comfortable to process it than it is to leave it lying in the body somewhere, in your system somewhere, because that does not feel good in the long term. It sometimes like distracts momentarily, but it is really not a long-term strategy.
And actually, I want to jump in something right before processing that can be a little bit nuanced. Like we talked about naming the trauma and the fact that it was trauma. Also identifying the source of that trauma, because sometimes we're not even we might see a bigger picture, and it's like actually the trauma was this specific thing in there. So
or this incident or this situation.
Yes,
and absolutely.
So it's really important to identify, like we said, the needs that are affected. Yes, if you can. Identifying what actually caused that trauma, because then it also helps us to navigate in the future different situations. Like, I am going to try really hard to not be in this situation if you have control over it.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, really important. Name it, identify what the trauma was. And again, like, is it a slight significant? That can be helpful. Knowing, and again, it might be nebulous. It might not be this thing that this person said at this, like, at 8:52 on Saturday the 29th of April, this person said this, and that was the traumatic event. It might just be, there was something, this situation was traumatic for me. And you may identify what it is, and you may not get that specific, but just identifying, here's the thing. The more specific you can get, the more effective the healing is likely to be, because of the next step in the process. But you work with what you got. You work with whatever you've got and whatever you know at that point in time. And this can be part of the reason that working with a professional can help, because sometimes that's the thing I find with clients, is that they come to me and they go like, this thing's bothering me. Like, why is this thing bothering me? It happened. We had a discovery session with a client last week where she was like, I've got this trauma in my past. And I was like, yeah, that trauma isn't really that trauma. It's really this trauma. And she was like, oh my, how has nobody ever noticed that? How has nobody identified that my entire life? So that's the reason that sometimes, like, working with a professional can help you to get to that point of like, oh, okay, hold on a second. I thought it was this, but actually more specifically, it's this. And the specificity can help us with the next part of the process.
And it also helps with the layers too, because you might identify the nebulous trauma, and then it's like, oh, now that I've dealt with the bigger picture, it's like, oh, actually, I think it was this. I think it was this. And that's when you start peeling back the layers and really get to that deep healing.
Yeah. It was like, I was at this event and that was traumatic for me. Actually, it was my interaction with this person at that event. That was what was traumatic for me. Oh, actually, it was this conversation with that person. Oh, it was this thing. Like, you can sometimes drill down to that level.
And it's not always necessary. No. So we don't want you to think like, oh, I'm not going deep enough. Yes. I can't do this, not do any of it. Like, go where you can, do what you can do.
Work with what you got.
There's layers that can be unlayered,
uncovered, discovered.
You know what I'm trying to
say.
Layers. They're layers.
And this is the reason that we say that if you can work with a professional on this, it will help, because they will help you to figure out those layers. So the next part is, this is really where the needs stuff kicks in and becomes the key to the healing and to the resilience. And that is identifying which needs have been compromised by the trauma. So there's the processing of the actual, so there's the coping, naming, identifying the trauma, at whatever level we're working at, whether we're working broad spectrum or whether we're working specific. There's processing the actual trauma itself, and then saying which needs, of mine, have been impacted by this situation. Trauma is our needs being negatively impacted. So identifying, going through the 12 needs and being like, was it this one? Yeah. No. Was it this one? No. Was it? Yes, that one definitely. Was it this one? Yes, definitely. Was this one? No. And a lot of the time it will be multiple needs. It won't just be one. I mean, I don't think I've ever had a situation with any client ever that's just been like, oh yes, it was just this one need. I'm like, because they all interlink with each other. There's this kind of interconnection and connection between them. So you need to identify what are the needs that have been compromised by the trauma. And then you make a concerted effort to meet and support those needs that have been compromised. So it's like, what needs have been impacted? And I'm going to make a concerted effort to now nourish those needs. So if you imagine that like each of your needs is like a bucket of water, and having the impact has taken out a bunch of water from that. This is you putting the water back in that bucket and filling it back up again to the same level it was at before the trauma happened, before it was impacted. So it's about consciously, intentionally supporting those same needs in a consistent way. Now, it may be that it's like, okay, so let's use the water analogy of the bucket. So say my value need, it had, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it British way. I'm going to do it British style. I can't do the American quantities. They mess with my head. So
we're going into the metric.
We're going metric. So say we had a litre of water in our bucket, and then the trauma happened, and it took 500 millilitres out, which is half a litre. So what we wanted to do was we want to put 500 millilitres back in, bring it back up to 1 litre. Now, we might want to do that initial thing of like, okay, there's been a big impact out. We want a big input in. However, it might be hot in the environment. Some of the water might evaporate. So it's not a one and done thing. And sometimes what can end up happening is that the need being negatively impacted can affect our belief in the fact that the need is worthy of being met. And so we want to make a concerted effort to keep, not just meet it need once, but keep it being met, because it's like, no, this need is worthy of being met. I'm worthy of having this need being met. And the fact that it was compromised could cause some question over that. But actually what I want to do is I want to build it back up again and keep building it up. So it's like, well, there's a little bit of water, or somebody comes along and they nudge the bucket and a little bit slips over the edge. Oh, okay, we'll put that back in again. So what we want to do is take that and cultivate the needs that have been impacted and make sure that they are returned and then continually supported after that fact.
I think I have a good example for that one in the context of needs. We talk about our foundation function need. the building blocks of that need is the need to sleep. And a lot of times when we have these traumatic situations, our sleep can be affected by it. We're not getting as much rest. Having one day or one good night of sleep, it's better than not. And is that really going to fill the bucket to the level?
Yeah, I'm going to go one step further than that. I'm going to say that, yeah, having one good night of sleep, that's not actually replenishing the bucket, because you're on minus 20 hours of sleep over several days, and 8 hours, well, that was just the 8 hours you were meant to have that day anyway. The interesting thing is that if you've ever been in that situation where you've had compromised sleep for a period of time, and then you might sleep for like a day or 2 days, and how do you feel after those 2 days of rest? You're like, normally you're like, what fuck happened? Like, I've had all this sleep. I thought, like, and sometimes you can feel discombobulated and everything, because it takes some time to recover from the fact that it was compromised in the first place. Another great example of this is surgery. If you have surgery and you physically heal, like, all the things are back connected the way they're meant to be connected again, but you might need some physiotherapy to actually get things working the way, and to continue to support those joints with that healing process, even though it's not, I mean, technically they're healed. Like, technically my back injury was healed 2 months in, but the repercussions of that healing, no. Like, that took a long time and is still taking time to this day. So it's like, understanding that we want to be making sure that we're taking care of their needs, we're replenishing what was taken out, and then we are making sure that we are taking care of them on an ongoing basis. And in our experience, this can not only reduce the impact of these experiences, it can shorten the healing process, because there is more to just a situation than the situation itself. Often, once we had that trauma, it's like, well, that trauma might affect my value need. Well, my value need might need a little bit more cultivation. So it's like, okay, the fact that this happened to me, does that mean I believe I'm worthy of this happening to me? Has that triggered that belief in me? Well, sometimes it takes some real concerted effort to kind of deprogram that belief that I'm believe that I'm worthy of that situation. More importantly, that then gets us back to neutral. Like deprogramming that just gets us back to neutral. Like I'm not worthy of good, I'm not worthy of bad, or I don't deserve good or I don't deserve bad. Then we want to cultivate that I deserve to be well, I deserve to have my needs met, I deserve to have a happy and fulfilling life. So there's so much to this, and these needs are very simplistic, but in our experience, they are the things that really make a difference with this healing process, because the trauma was our negatively impacted needs. We have to go and rectify that in order to heal from that. And then there might be the ripple effect of the trauma. We want to address, well, what needs were impacted by the ripple effect as well? How do we go back and meet those, so that what we can do is we can return to the state that we were in before the trauma happened? So I think that one of the things that tends to come up is triggers and trauma. Like, what's the difference? How do they, like, I'm like, I get that I'm triggered and that was probably because of a trauma, but what?
What's the difference?
What? And the thing is that this is all related. A lot of this comes up and is relevant when we're looking at trauma healing from the past. Like, normally we get to know that there has been trauma in the past due to our triggers. And the triggers are the things that happen in the present moment that trigger a trauma that has been unhealed from the past. So it initiates either the physical response or the trauma responses we mentioned in the last episode, or the physical responses. When we start to notice that, that is an indicator that we have a trigger, and the presence of a trigger shows an unhealed trauma. Now, the interesting thing is, let's use the example of what Serena just experienced. Serena was triggered every time this situation was mentioned. She was triggered a lot of the time she interacted with the person that was present in this situation, that was responsible for a lot of what happened in that situation. Now,
I was getting triggered anytime somebody mentioned where this situation happened.
Yes.
Like, just the mention of it, I was like,
and that's the thing, is that, but what was happening is that she wasn't being conscious of what was happening when that was happening. She just went, oh, doesn't feel good. Rather than going, why doesn't it feel good? And the why it didn't feel good is because it was triggering this thing that was happening back here. Now, what's triggering in the moment, the triggers could be any one of a number of things. The trigger could be another trauma. It might be a trauma that is connected to this same trauma, and this chain reaction happens, and that's it triggers that unhealed wound from that trauma. It might be that the trigger, as Serena said, is just somebody mentioning the person, or like speaking to the person. There's no trauma happening in the moment, but speaking to the person who was responsible for the trauma in the first place, that could be a trigger. Mentioning the place it happened, that could be a trigger. So all of these things, like, triggers can take lots of different forms, but the triggers are actually normally a really good indicator of the fact that there is an unhealed trauma somewhere. Like, if somebody says something to us, and normally what ends up happening is that how we identify a trigger is that our response does not feel proportionate to what is happening in the present. So it's like somebody like does me a little paper cut on my arm by accident, and I respond like my arm's been broken. It might be because the paper cut is existing on top of unhealed skin, on top of an unhealed broken arm. That's the reason I'm responding that way, because there is a broken arm under the process. The person who gave me the paper cut, I mean, yeah, it's a trauma. It's a tiny trauma, but it's landing
but a flesh wound.
It's but a flesh wound, but it is on a broken arm underneath the surface. It may be that as I said, the person doesn't even, like, there's no trauma in the present moment, but what they do is they take you back to that moment where the arm was broken. And it's like, we remember the pain of the arm breaking. Like, we speak to the person who broke our arm, and we remember the feeling of having our arm broken. Like, all of these things can act as triggers. And so there's a great analogy that we use with this, which is that our triggers are like landmines. Except the trigger is the trigger response on the landmine. The trauma is the landmine itself. So that's what explodes. The trigger is like, oh, hold on, we've stepped on it. Now what? So every trauma that is unhealed, when we step on it, or when somebody else steps on it, or when somebody points it out, doesn't matter whether the trauma is conscious or unconscious. Basically, once you become aware of it, once you hear that click, that's the sign. That's your notice.
Mm-hmm.
Something about underneath you is about to explode if you do not heal it. Now, what can happen is some people can be like, I'm going to step back from this and go this way around.
I see you right there, and I'm going to avoid
I'm going
it.
to shuffle around this way so that it doesn't detonate.
And the problem with that is some rando could come along and all of a sudden just jump, have no clue, and it's like,
boom. Exactly. So if you don't, you just leave it. Either someone else can trigger, or you can trigger it. You can step over, like you can fall over it again, trip over it at another moment, be like, oh shit, I'd totally forgotten that was even there.
I mean, I trip over my feet all the time. Like, I mean, avoiding a landmine like that. I mean, and I know it sounds kind of silly, but we think of the fact like, oh, I know that trauma is there. I'm just going to avoid it. And then we inadvertently end up circling back, don't realize we've circled back, and then we end up triggering it again. And I think a lot of times it's very easy to focus on when somebody else triggers something you've avoided, but to come back and be like, oh shit, I've done it again.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about it is you want to diffuse all of the triggers and remove all of the landmines from the field of your life. So you can go dancing through your field as much as you want. And anybody else can come dancing through your field as much as they want. And they're not going to trigger any of your unhealed traumas. Now, this is not to say you have to be perfect in this and you have to get them all done and blah, 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 like you must. I must get rid of all of my landmines. I'm going to go through my field and I'm going to test every blade of grass until every single one has been tested. That's not realistic. Mm-hmm. But when things come up and you notice them, yes, you can go and look for them. But you look for a mound that's kind of landmine size and shape. You don't check the every blade of grass. Mm-hmm. You look for something that might be, or something that, like you remember last time you got that, you heard a bit of a ticking sound, like when you were in that vicinity. And I'm like, hold on, I think there might be something around there. Let's go and see if there is a landmine in that place. And
at that point, you want to resource yourself. You want to put on your landmine suit. You want to make sure that your shields are completely up. So you're like, you know what? I'm going to go into this, and my outcome
you don't
is
see a bomb disposal expert wandering in like a tank top, shorts, and some flip flops, do you?
Not usually. I mean,
well,
maybe down
West,
here.
Yes.
But I got this.
Fair
shit.
point.
And that's the thing. Like going into it, and
hold my beer.
Yeah.
I mean, it would.
Oh my God.
It's got to be a good possibility.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And there it goes.
Sorry.
No. I have the thought, but now I'm thinking about what like a bomb disposal down here. Like, just, woo. Anywho. So you want to go into that, and the hope is that it's not going to go off. That you're going to be able to detonate it, or no, you're going to be able to defuse it before it detonates. But there is the chance. Anytime you go into this, there is a chance it's going to detonate, and that you want to be resourced in case it does. So it's taking your shields down a little bit less than it would have if you went in depleted. And you can't necessarily measure the effect. Actually, scratch that. You can't measure the effect that trauma is going to have on you. You can think that you might, but it's going to hit you how it hits you.
Yes. Absolutely.
So it's very important if you are approaching your landmine or that ticking and you're like, where is it? I know it's somewhere
down here. Yeah, absolutely.
Resource. And
the thing about landmines, i.e. triggers, is that there can often be a domino effect where one person, or you, step on one landmine and all of a sudden there's a chain reaction. It's like pew, 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 and there's all these different things. And all of a sudden you're dealing with 12 explosions at once rather than just one. Likewise, sometimes this can happen where somebody else steps on a landmine over the other side of your field. Like you can barely even see what's going on. It's in the far distance. And this chain reaction means that it ends up at your door and you end up in a puddle and you don't even know why. So sometimes in order to heal, it's about tracing the landmines back one at a time to reach the source, like diffusing every single one of them as you go. I can't remember, but there was a situation, I'm sure, with the two of us where you had a situation and I was like, okay, let's go back. What was this? What was this? What was this? And then eventually we're like, oh, that's where this came from. Like, and it happens with clients all the time where it's like, I was really upset by this situation. I don't know why. And I mean, okay, let's look at this situation. So we looked at that situation, then hold on a second. Well, that leads to this situation. And this leads to this situation. And this leads to this situation. Oh, there's my childhood trauma sitting there waiting for me underneath it all.
Hi.
Yes, hey. Where have you been?
Welcome back.
Could have done with you. You sorting this out a little while back. But that's the thing, is that like it's also important to be gentle with yourself and not judge yourself. Like we were talking about this earlier today, and it was funny how we were talking about like intergenerational trauma. And I was talking about the fact that this trauma does get passed on generation to generation. And I was thinking about, I mean, I've spoken about my relationship with my grandfather before on this podcast. And yeah, he had trauma from his past and from his childhood. But at the time that he lived, well, he's still alive now, but like the time when he had the ability to do something about it before it got passed down to me, what were the resources available? Like, did he have resources available? Were there people he could go to for help as far as the thing? Would he have been like put in a hospital somewhere because they believed it was a chemical issue rather than actually just a human response? Like, it's interesting, like how, like, if we didn't know, if you weren't listening to this podcast right now and nobody had ever said the word trauma to you before and nobody had ever talked about healing or landmines or any of these things, would you know? I learned because I learned from other people. And so we want to be gentle with ourselves and not expect ourselves to have had all the answers and to have done this work at a time we didn't even know this work existed.
I feel like dealing with trauma, a lot of times I should have known better. I should have known better.
Yes.
Like how many situations I put myself in where I have legitimately put myself in it. And I come out, I'm like, I should have known better. And yeah, maybe there was an aspect of like, if I had taken a beat to just be like, all right, what is this situation? I may have figured it out. But that's not the reality of the world.
Or you might have gone,
in.
oh, maybe that's not a good idea. I'm not entirely sure why, but maybe that's not a good idea.
And
but there's a difference
done it,
between maybe it's not a good idea, and that's going to cause me trauma, so I don't want to do that shit.
Right, and most of us aren't thinking of the potential traumatic situations or God, I could go down I could totally Alice this right now down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to stop myself right here because I'm really like, I'm like clawing up the dirt.
I can see you like just like hanging over the edge of the hole. Like, ooh, what's down there?
Like I'm like holding my pop screen just so I don't fall down.
Right, I got you.
My dress over my head, trying to eat cookies and grow big, you know. Back to the podcast.
So I think that there are kind of two applications of this, and it's really, I mean, obviously we tend to experience triggers and trauma a lot of the time relating to what's happened in our past because of what we've just been talking about. No one's taught us how to heal these things. No one's taught us these were things that needed healing. They were like, oh, that's just part of life. That's adulting for you. Carry on.
Not even healing, just identifying them. I feel like we're starting to get into a place where, you know, mental health isn't a conversation. Like trauma is a thing and people are identifying like this is traumatic, where I feel like there was a generation where it's like, toughen up. This
Absolutely.
is life. Like,
I mean, there was an entire slogan in the UK in the war for it. Keep calm and carry on. Like, people were being bombed. And that was the response. Keep calm and carry on. Like that was
where that came from?
Yeah. That was war propaganda. I don't know if it's propaganda. but it's like it was there were posters that were up during the war in the UK, like keep calm and carry on. That was the mentality of the British people. You wonder why we've got a fuck ton of repressed individuals in the UK. Good starting point. As well as a bunch of, I mean, yeah. Another rabbit hole. We're not going to dive down. But I think there's two really important things. It's like looking at how do we heal trauma of the past? Because a lot of the time it's like, well, how do I go back and heal that? That happened so long ago. Like, how is doing something now going to help with what happened back then? Now, the thing about it is that the process is very much the same. Like, we still want to look at what compromised my needs back, what needs were compromised by then, right? Go through the steps, naming it, identifying what the source of the trauma, figuring out what needs, processing it. Like, again, processing it. How much of the childhood trauma that we've had, or things that have happened to us in childhood, we didn't process. We didn't feel it. We didn't cry. We didn't shout and scream and punch a pillow about it. We just got on with it. Like, we just kept going, or we repressed it, or we dissociated, or whatever it was that we did. So we want to go through the steps with the things that happened back then. So we want to be processing it. We want to figure out what were the needs. And by meeting the needs in the present moment, we start to address the fact that they were not met in the past. And the consistency is the thing that is also going to change things going forward, because the lack of it not being met for such a long time meant that we tend to have internalized that, is then we were not worthy of having it met, or we weren't supposed to have it met, we didn't deserve to have it met. But by consciously and intentionally meeting that need going forward, we start to address some of that belief system that's built up around that as well. Now, it does make a difference as to whether it was in childhood or whether it was in adulthood, like the trauma that happened. Because when we're looking at childhood experiences, we want to basically go back and reparent that aspect of ourselves, because at that point we were a child. We were not responsible for meeting our own needs. That was the responsibility of our parents or our caregivers or the people around us. And sometimes that is about naming that, and naming that the people who should have been meeting our needs were not doing so, and making how we felt about that, like validating how we felt about that. It's okay that we feel this way about that, like, and treating that part of us the way that we would a child. Like, if we were if I had like a 4-year-old sat in front of me whose needs have been compromised, I wouldn't be going, well, here's this need, and here, go meet this need for yourself. Which, with compassion, obviously I would say to an adult, not necessarily in exactly those words, but that would be the essence I would be getting to, is that it's now our responsibility as an adult to meet these for ourselves. It's a very different conversation when you're having that with a child, because it's not their responsibility. And naming that it was never their responsibility, naming that it was other people should have done this, and naming it's okay to feel the way that we feel about it, and to process how we feel about it. And yes, to go back and meet those needs, and to be the parent that we never had as a child, to be the parent and even if we had amazing parents who tried their best and did a really good job in a lot of ways, every parent fucks up at some point in some way. Every parent does. And it might be just that one moment that they did had this ripple effect through our life. So we go back and we give ourselves, we are the parent that we needed in that moment. And for whatever reason, maybe because of their own trauma, maybe because of their own lack of knowledge, maybe for their own shit that was going on in their life. That was what, like, doesn't matter what the reason was. What matters is that we can go back and be that parent for ourselves and recognize and relating to that part of us as, this was nothing to do with you. This was not your responsibility. This is something that someone should have given you. And I'm now going to give that to you, and starting to heal that aspect of ourselves through giving that to ourselves.
And I want to say, especially during this, I'm going to go back to resource yourself before you go into this. If you do realize that you have to reparent yourself, as somebody who's done this, and I had a very loving mother, yes, there are a couple of things that are really fucked up. And in adulthood, I'm like, oh, that was a fucked up situation for a child to be in for whatever reason. And that in itself was hard to kind of unpack. Like, realizing these things, there's going to be levels and there's going to be many boxes to unpack in that. And I just want to say, yeah, lots of nuance. Just be really gentle with yourself and realize that you may have some realizations that are tough to swallow. Like, you may, like Claire said, you may have had what you thought was idyllic childhood, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, like, shit. I just polished that sheen off. But if that's what the reality is, that's where you can begin the healing process.
And sometimes that can happen where it's like, yes, you thought you had this idyllic childhood, and how sometimes your parents manage the difference between you and your sibling could have like that could be like, and in a moment where they were just trying to take care of your siblings' needs, but how you internalized it was, I'm not important, I don't matter, they're more important than I am. That can be a big thing. And that's not something that's a shortcoming of a parent. That's just can sometimes be a situational thing that they just didn't know how to handle to the best of everybody in the moment. They were doing their best and they didn't do it as well as they could have done, or there was just nothing they could have done, and how that got internalized impacted you. All of these things are valid. All of these options are valid. And it's important to realize that just something I'm going to note around this is that when you are an adult who already feels like you're struggling a little bit, or that you've got a lot of burden on you, that this can sometimes feel like a lot, because it feels like, oh God, there's something more I've got to add to my plate. I've now got a little kid inside me I've got to take care of, as well as me as an adult, and I'm barely holding on like myself.
You got a couple little kids in there.
Yeah.
Just saying.
True story. And the thing about it is that, so what was I saying? Yes. So how other people can sometimes do this, sometimes do this work, can sometimes leave it feeling like there's even more burden and responsibility and more pressure on the individual for you as an adult. It's the reason that I'm not going to go into the depth of it, or how exactly it is that we do this, but when we do this kind of work with clients, there is something that we do to make sure that the adult in you has somewhere to go, to be supported, to get resources, and to be held in the same ways that inner child wants to be held. You as an adult, you still have needs, and you still have that ability, that need to feel like you're not alone in this. And so that's just something I just want to mention here, because I think it's one of the pieces that's missing from a lot of inner child work, and it is unbelievably helpful to make somebody not feel like, oh God, I've got even more to do now. There's even more pressure on me, which can really which can happen a lot.
Mm-hmm. Our inner children are oftentimes a lot in general. Like when I do inner child work with my inner teenager, I need a supportive area as the adult to be like, okay, like there's this container while I deal with her, and she's fucking pissed and has every right to be. Mm-hmm. And I have to come back to adult at some point, and I don't want to come back to adult and be like, well, fuck that. And there's a way to do it that is sustainable, then that is healthier.
Think about it like parenting in general. Like, parents need support. Mm-hmm. They need they say it takes a village for a reason. Mm-hmm. Because like they need friends they can go to, and places that they can be held, and places they can fall apart when the baby's in screaming their head off all day, where they can go and just be like in a puddle in the floor, because that's how they're feeling based on what's going on in their life. So the same is true when we're doing this in terms of this trauma healing. So it's slightly different when we're doing things from the point of view of a trauma that's happened in adulthood, because in adulthood, it was our responsibility to meet our needs for ourselves, but maybe we didn't know how. Maybe we were never taught how. Maybe we didn't have the information how. And so it's now a question of like, I'm not making myself wrong for doing that, but I'm going to relate to myself differently in the trauma, like in the healing the trauma from an adult, that adult me experienced versus child me. So like I had we've talked about this, I've had very unhealthy and abusive relationships. Now, if I'd been in that situation as a child, how I would have related to healing that trauma versus how I related to healing that trauma with me as an adult who experienced that were very, very different, because I had a different level of capacity, ability, and responsibility as an adult that I did as a child. So we just need to be mindful of the fact that there is a distinction and difference in how we approach that. And so the final thing is like, how do you do trauma healing for things that are in the present? Well, the interesting thing about this is we just do the trauma process in the present. What we want to do is we want to do it as soon as possible in a way that is not going to negatively impact our needs. So like Serena said, like you want to resource yourself a little bit before doing this. So if you experience a trauma and you go straight into trying to heal that trauma without any resource, or like having addressed the fact that this has just happened, it may not be as effective. But what we want to do is, by doing that, what it can do is it can create healing in that moment or very soon after it. So it prevents the trauma from staying as an open wound and creating a trigger going forward. So a great example for this was when I got reversed over by the truck. I, like in the moment itself, like minutes after it happened, everybody around me was losing their shit. Mm-hmm. The driver was in a thing. I had like people coming up to me. There was the guy that I knew on the beach who like emptied the trash cans every morning. Like he and I always said hi to each other, so we knew each other. There were other people who were exercising on the beach and everything, and everyone came around me when it first happened. They were like, we need to go in ambulance, and everyone was this, and I remember just being like, can everyone just shut the hell up for 2 minutes? And everyone was like, isn't this what we're meant to do when there's like a crisis? Like, no, shut the hell up. And I just went through and I was like, needs like one by one. okay, foundation function. Like, where am I at? Physically, I've got a couple of bumps and bruises, but like everything is moving. Like, I don't feel like I have any like serious injuries. Security, like take some deep breaths. Feel my feet on the ground. Like in this moment right here, right now, I am okay. I am safe. I'm not in that situation right now. I basically went through the tree in that moment. Now I knew I was going to need to process the emotions that were relevant from that were present from that situation. I also knew that was not a safe environment for me to be doing that in, because everybody else would have lost their shit. I'm like, the last thing I need is to deal with everybody else's trauma on top of my own. Like, no, not dealing with that. I actually supported the driver in being able to get out of that situation. People are like, wait, what? Like, I remember I hugged him. He was like, why are you hugging me? Why are you being so nice to me? I just ran over you. I'm like, because I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. I know how to deal with this. So I made sure he was okay. I kind of dealt with the situation. I went home and I processed. And I have a very dear friend of mine who does a technique for processing emotional called gentle reprocessing. I reached out to her. I was like, would you be able to do me a session? She said, yes, absolutely. We went and did that process. Like, I processed what had happened, and then I went through, like, what are the things that I need? Like, what are the needs that were impacted in that moment? How do I meet this need? How do I meet this need? And very soon afterwards, I was in a place where I'm like, I still go down to the beach sometime for sunrise. And it's not like every time I see the truck, I have a trauma response, or every time I'm like, it goes past me. I'm like that would have been a very understandable reaction to what had happened to me. But because I actually processed the trauma as quickly as possible after the event itself, it prevented me from carrying that unhealed trauma forward, and it meant that I don't have the same triggers. Now, don't get me wrong. If I went to exactly the same spot and laid down in exactly the same position with exactly the same headphones, but I'm like, how do I make sure my needs get met in the future? I'm not going to that spot anymore, because it's not easy for someone to see me lying on the beach because of all the shade. I don't use my noise cancelling headphones unless I have my back up against a tree, because they can't run over a freaking tree. It's going to break the truck. Like, that's going to be an issue for them. So what I did was I found ways of meeting, what do I do to make sure that this doesn't happen to me again in the future, so I get to feel safe? Because I didn't feel safe because of what happened. So what do I do to make sure I create safety for myself going forward? I knew I was safe in that moment. I felt more so. I met my security need more, and I made sure I knew what to do in order to meet that forward. And that's the thing, is that if we do this as these things happen to us, then our field gets to stay clear of landmines. Mm-hmm. A lot of us didn't learn how to do this as we go through life. We didn't get taught how to do this. So we already have a bunch of landmines from the stuff that happened before. So it's like, yeah, we want to go back, and like, when they come up, oh, there's a landmine, let's go diffuse that one. Oh, there's another one, let's go diffuse that one. Oh, I think there might be some stuff around my great aunt Edna. Like, oh, I go and explore the great aunt Edna area of my field. Oh, yeah, look, there's a biggie right there in the middle. Let's diffuse that one. And then, but the key thing is, we don't want to be adding landmines to the field. And every time we experience a trauma and we don't heal from it, and that's the thing, is that a lot of people are still carrying around the collective trauma of the pandemic. They have not even processed what happened during the pandemic.
Most people haven't even identified, named that it was a trauma.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
One thing that I want to add to the healing from, whether it's in the present or from your childhood, it can be scary to think about, like, some traumas, the slights, the, significance, but especially with the severe ones or the any of the sustained ones, it can be difficult to even think about going back to some of those moments.
It can feel scary.
Very much so. Yeah. And especially if you were in a specific place, like if you're going back to a trauma that you knew you were not in a good place when this trauma happened, the thought of knowingly walking back into these situations can be scary, and be like, oh, why would I do that to myself? Why would I even want to go there? Like, that's in the past. It's not going to bother me anymore. That person that caused that trauma is no longer around. Yeah. Like, if you do not heal from your traumas, they will not go away. Yes. And they will be the underlying thing that it could affect things that you never even thought they had. Like, you could have a trauma that is in relation to a relationship, like an intimate relationship. And, you know, that relationship is no more, that person's no longer present, and you're like, oh, done, I'm good. And then something happens at work that all of a sudden triggers those landmines. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, fuck, why am I thinking about this person? And it's like, because that trauma was never healed. And going back into it, and I speaking from my own personal experience, I'm like, I can't believe I'm fucking going here again. But once I go there, I'm like, it's that like, okay.
I'm not carrying it anymore.
I'm not carrying it. And now I can move forward a little more cleanly. And sometimes I think I'm past it. And I'm like, there's still a little gravitational pull. And I'm like,
there's another layer underneath that you didn't realize
that I didn't realize was there. And then it's like every time, and you can choose, you can be like, you know what? I don't have the capacity for this. I see you. I hear you, trauma, and I will revisit you. And that's okay too. Like we're not saying push yourself beyond your capacity. Always honor your capacity and where you're at.
And I think the thing about it is, there's a couple of things I want to add to that, which is that when it comes to trauma, you don't always have to go back into it fully in order to process it and to heal it. Like a lot of the times, I think that some professionals will take people into that space and actually just re-traumatize them. Like there's not a purpose to what is happening in that. And I think that that's the reason that seeking out a professional that feels in alignment for you and getting guidance with this process is really important. Because sometimes it might just be, there might be one aspect of it that it feels like that's the thing that really has been holding me back. And I just want to connect into it enough to open the gateway to process the emotion that was connected to it. We don't have to go into all the minutia and all of the details and all of the full extent of the trauma.
You're saying you don't have to like necessarily relive it?
Oh, absolutely not. Like sometimes there are some moments that we might need to reconnect to. It's not even necessarily reliving, because sometimes we don't, like, if the trauma is present enough, like actually just like thinking about the place that it happened. Sometimes that can be all that's necessary. And it's like, oh, this is now coming up. This is like the stuff that's coming up as a result of me just remembering that place. And like, as someone who has done work on these kind of things with clients, that to say, like, I mean, there's a couple of things. The first thing is, very rarely do we go into all of the detail of any experience. A lot of the time it's like, well, what's most present for you around that? Like, what is the thing that is like front and center when you start thinking about that? And normally you just have to like tap into that a little bit. And it's like, oh, this is what's up. This is how I'm feeling. Now, the other thing about the feeling process is that a lot of people are afraid that once they open the door to the emotions, they're going to get overwhelmed. So they're going to end up drowning in it. It's like, well, I can't get a breath, blah, 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 blah.
I can't stop.
Yeah. And I'm like, what do I do with and what do I do with this? Because we're not taught how to process emotions. We're not taught what that process looks like. And so I think that it's important to say that in my experience, having done this myself and having worked with other people who've been in this space, is that the time it takes to actually fully feel something, when you allow yourself to fully feel it, is very, very short comparatively with what we expect it to be. Like, there has been research that has shown that if you go fully into something, it can take as little as 90 seconds to fully process an emotion, to fully feel an emotion. Now, it's not to say that if you're not doing it in 90 seconds, you're doing something wrong, or you're not doing it effectively enough. But in my experience of working with clients in this, it's rarely longer than a few minutes that somebody is in the experience of feeling the emotion, because once they feel it, it starts to process and it starts to dissipate and it starts to release. So it's really important to recognize that you want to be doing this with somebody who is going to help you to feel reassured, who is going to help you to feel like, okay, they've got me through this process. Like, they're not doing the process, but they're going to hold this container for me to this process, and they're going to help me to go where I need to go. They're also not going to force me to go to places that are unnecessary for my healing process and could re-traumatize me.
That right there.
And there are a lot of professionals,
a lot of very known professionals.
Yes. who will do that. They will take people into the worst experiences of their lives and they will make them relive every single aspect of it. And there is absolutely no purpose in that situation with that person to do that. And from my experience, it's very, very rare for that to happen. In fact, I'm going to say, I don't think I've ever had that with any client. It's like, what is the thing? What is the thing that is the root of the trauma? What is the thing? And the thing that's the root of the trauma is almost always the thing that's most present. Like, what is the thing that every time I think about this moment, that's what I think about. Mm-hmm. Every time, like, what is it? What's it about that moment in time? And that moment in time sometimes can be as long, like as little as a few seconds. And it can be it can be about reconnecting to that moment and then allowing the process to happen from there. And then be like, okay, in that moment, with that thing that happened in that moment, which needs were compromised. And then we go into that space. But I think that emotions are really scary because if you haven't been taught how to process them, then there's this feeling of like, oh God, it feels like free diving in the middle of the ocean with no boat and no land anywhere nearby. It's like, well, what happens if I get tired halfway through and I need to break? Like, what happens? And what happens if I get lost? And I mean, if you've ever been in the middle of the ocean where you cannot see land on any side, you can feel really disorientated. It's like, well, what if there's nobody with a map going, it's okay, just keep going this direction. If you just keep going this direction, you've got another half a mile and then you'll see land. And then you can panic and go, well, maybe it's this way. And you can end up swimming out to sea, going further out to sea. Mm-hmm. So it's like, that's the reason that having this container. And I will say that as far as finding a professional that works for you, it really is a question of trusting your gut as to, this feels like somebody who feels like they know what they are doing, that they have the experience and the skill set and the knowledge to help me through this. And I feel like they are someone who I can trust to be in this space, and listen to your gut. As far as that process is concerned, it's worked for me. And it's the thing I say to anybody who's interested in becoming a client, like, you need to take time to think about it and see whether it feels like this is a right fit. If it feels like a good fit, great. If it doesn't feel like a good fit, great. Like, it doesn't matter which it is. It matters that you feel like you're working with the right person. And especially when it comes to trauma, it is really important that you are working with somebody who it feels like you can feel safe with, and that they are going to be able to support you effectively through this journey. And I mean, I've been with clients where they've walked in going, oh God, we're going to do this thing today. And it can feel really scary and really like, they're going to be like, oh God, what are you going to make me do? I'm like, I'm not going to make you do anything. You're guiding this. I will just act as your little guide, but you know what I mean? Like, you're the one who's setting the destination. I'll just be here to help you if at any point along the way it's like, well, no, we're a little off course. How about we try this way? And how about we try this way? It's like, oh, you're the one setting the course. It's like, well, my outcome is here and I'm here. And it's like, well, as an expert, as a guide, I can help you to find the shortcut to there, rather than going the long way around the houses that you might do if you went on your own. You're the one who sets the outcome, but it's having somebody who can help support you through in getting there in the quickest, easiest and most effective way, that doesn't then cause more trauma, that gives you more to heal from.
And chances are the process is going to be uncomfortable because
that's just part of it.
That's just trauma in general. Yeah. So there's a difference between uncomfortability and
having unhealed trauma is uncomfortable.
Yes.
So I think that's the thing, is that yes, the process of healing trauma is uncomfortable, but having unhealed trauma is the way I view this is, it's a little bit like having unchilled trauma is a little bit like having something that is at a low level affecting the whole of your life. So imagine like you have, this is kind of like an odd thing to kind of compare it to, but if imagine unhealed trauma being like a stone in your shoe, like underneath your heel. And every time you step on it, it's not completely debilitating, but it is affecting everything. It's going to affect your alignment. It's going to affect your posture. It's probably going to end up with bruising. It might end up breaking the skin. It might end up actually breaking bones because of how you compensate for it. Like, it's there constantly.
It might affect where you're going, how far you go.
Exactly. All of those sorts of things in life. And it's constantly going to affect everything. Now, it might sometimes So if you had that unhealed trauma, imagine it's like changing my metaphor slightly here, but imagine it's like a stone that's actually slightly embedded into your heel. Like sometimes it might be painful to get it out. Like if you're getting a splinter out, sometimes it hurts to get the splinter out. It can be, I remember doing this with my mum when I was back in the UK, and she was like, can you help me get this splinter out? And sometimes you have to use a needle to kind of get the end of it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have to squeeze the skin, and it's really painful in that moment that you squeeze the skin to get it out. So we're going to ignore the stone in the shoe. We're going back to the splinter analogy. So imagine that unhealed trauma is that splinter in your finger that you catch all the time and it hurts every time you do this. It's not going to be debilitating, but it is affecting your life all the time. And the trauma healing process is like that process of like taking the needle and kind of getting the end of it up and squeezing it and pushing it, and sometimes you're pushing into it and you're making it go sometimes go a little further in order to get hold of it to then be able to pull it out. But once you take it out, very quickly after that, it's not going to affect you anymore. Any effect will be negligible going forward, mm-hmm. as opposed to that thing that was always present and affecting everything. Maybe not as much as it, like that intensity, like the process of actually taking it out is a lot of the time a lot more painful than it is when you kind of catch it or there's the pressure on it or those sorts of things. And it's one and done. Mm-hmm. With that splinter, with that piece of the trauma. There might be other layers of trauma, but with that piece of trauma, once you actually do the effective healing on it, it's then, okay, this now doesn't affect me anymore. Mm-hmm. So while it might be more painful in the short term, long term, you get a much happier existence, and much less pain. That smaller amount of pain over the rest of your life, actually, when you add it up, is far more than it is to just take the damn thing out in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Anything you want to add before we finish up for today?
I'm good for today.
We have shared a lot in this trauma series, and we have gone, like, we expected this to be a little bit more bang, 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 bang. Here are the things.
Yeah, the trauma series was supposed to be 3 quicker episodes.
Shorter episodes. Yeah, that didn't really work. And we thought they would be more succinct and more to the point, and yeah. That's not how we work, and you should know this by now. And if you don't, and you're welcome to the crew. If this is your first like dipping of the toe into working into listening to our podcast. But I do think that everything we've covered in here has been really important and really valuable. And if there's something else you want to know about this, then please do let us know. Get in touch with us and tell us what more you want to know about, because we just scratched the surface with this topic, and there are going to be far more episodes and far more depth that we're going to go to in the future. So we look forward to hearing from you about that. But for now, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. Stay safe. And remember, between now and next time, to continue to meet your own needs. Lots of love.
Bye, friends. Hey, guess what?
What?
We remembered 2 things.
Yay!
I mean...
If you listen to the last episode while Serena is hacking up.
Some days we can try and change the world. Some days I choke on my own spit. And here we are.
If you saw the last episode, that's what she was referring to, was where I was going with that.
Yes. If you watch the podcast or listen to it often, you know, train of thought is something that sometimes, just occasionally, will get away from us. But not only have we gotten back on track, we remembered it 2 days later.
Look at us.
So here we are with a little add-on for you.
Yes. So this actually kind of came to me as I was editing this episode, and I suddenly realized that something we didn't speak to, which is really, really important to kind of note, is that the more level of marginalization that you have, and especially the more intersections of marginalization you sit at the intersection of, the more traumas you're going to be experiencing just by existing in everyday life. Like, that is just the reality of the society that we live in and the cultural system that we live in. So the more level of marginalization, the more traumas you experience. Well, what that means is that it's going to require more energy and effort and thought, like mental labor, emotional labor, to process and heal those traumas. So the more level of, as I was listening to the episode, I was kind of imagining, like, if I had more levels of marginalization, I'm like, fuck, the amount of trauma I experience every single day, there's a lot in order to heal those traumas. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we don't want to be making the effort to heal those traumas, but it does mean that our capacity is lower the more level of intersections of marginalization we sit at.
Well, and you'd have to probably say, like, I don't think a lot of people understand that when somebody is marginalized, a lot of times they are getting those impacts constantly every single day. So
when they leave the house, when they don't leave the house,
they're trying to heal traumas as they're being traumatized. And it sounds like a vicious, I mean, just it sounds like a cluster, like not even like it's just, I can't imagine.
It's like, I mean, you often talk about fire hose with us. Like, it's like that constantly swimming upstream and like logs hitting you and things hitting you and people chucking stuff from the riverbanks at you, like while you're trying to run upstream. So it's like, it's this constant barrage of trauma that you are experiencing. And you just have to look at what's happening politically right now and what's been happening politically over the last few years to see certain marginalized groups and the amount of trauma they are dealing with. And we're not just talking about the big things here. We're talking about just the day-to-day things from existing. I mean, we're talking about the big things as well. Like I'm not saying we discount those, but there is so much that those of us with privilege don't see in terms of the day-to-day traumas, especially when you look at our definitions of trauma. You go and you look at the slight traumas that are happening at a momentary level, but actually they're not happening at a momentary level because they are sustained, because they're experiencing that same trauma over and over and over again, sometimes multiple times a day, just from existing in the world. And so I thought it was really important to recognize, to say within this, is that as a result of that, the more privilege that we have, the more responsibility we have for starting to change the system, because we have more capacity to do that because we're not dealing with all of the same level of trauma. That's not to say we don't deal with trauma. We just don't deal with trauma due to that aspect of our being. Like, I don't deal with trauma for being a white person. I don't deal with trauma for being for being physically able. If a black woman would experience trauma for simply the fact that she's black, like being black in this world means that she's going to experience trauma on a regular basis. I don't experience that trauma. Everybody experiences trauma. We already said that. So it's not saying that we don't experience any. It's just that they're experiencing all the same kinds of traumas that we're experiencing, and they're experiencing another whole layer of trauma on top of that is happening. Transgenerational trauma, and then day-to-day traumas that they're experiencing. So just we because there, as a result, we have more capacity to be a part of changing the system, because changing the system is, one, it's our responsibility because it benefits us, and we have more social power to change the system. But also, it's our responsibility because it actually benefits us and our needs. Because as we've spoken about the interconnectedness, if other people's needs are being compromised, or our needs are being met in the ways that compromise others, it actually undermines our needs. Nobody's needs are really well met until everybody's needs are really well met. And so it's really important to be a part of this process and to recognize the more privilege we have, the more it's our responsibility to be active in that change.
So would you say, like, the more privilege that we have, the more capacity that, like, with privilege comes capacity?
Yeah, I don't think that's the thing, is that I don't think that with privilege comes capacity. I think that with marginalization comes a cost in capacity. So if you think about it, it's like it would take more effort for somebody with marginalization to deal with the trauma that they have, and therefore that effort reduces their capacity, like it drains their capacity a little bit more. So with all of those traumas, every single one is gonna require some energy and effort, and that energy and effort requires capacity. So if you don't have to deal with those same traumas, you don't have to deal with those same traumas, you get to keep that capacity. It's not that privilege gives you capacity necessarily, it's just that your capacity doesn't get compromised in the same way when you hold privilege as it does when you're more marginalized. So this is obviously, I mean, we've talked about various aspects of this, but just as I was listening to editing the podcast, I was like, we need to speak this. We need to name this, because this is really important for us to recognize that we're not all walking, it's not an even playing field when we're out there as far as trauma is concerned. And so those of us who aren't being hit by those aspects of trauma, it's our responsibility to use the capacity we have from not having that and be a part of changing the system so that everybody's needs are so that the system, because at the moment we're in a system which is working against everybody getting their needs met, except for maybe a very, very small minority of people. But for the majority of people, and I would argue as to whether it's actually meeting their needs or not. I mean, the way it's meeting them is probably not actually fulfilling them anyway. So, but that a layer of nuance to one side, the majority of us, we're living in a culture where the ecosystem around us, and that by the ecosystem I mean our physical ecosystem, but I also mean our social ecosystem, is working against getting our needs met. Like, it's not supporting us in getting our needs met. And so for us to try to get our needs met, we're working against that as well. Now, the extent to which we're working against it is greater or lesser depending on the level of marginalization. We got to work, like, there's even more working against us the more marginalization we have. But the system is working against us all. It's not actually supporting any of us in getting our needs adequately met. So we all need the systems change. We all need the systems change in such a way that's going to be supportive of getting our needs met, because it needs to be supportive of getting everybody's needs met. And so by us having the capacity, having a little bit more capacity, because we're not compromised in that same way, it's our responsibility to be a part of changing that system in a way that, yes, is going to be supportive of us. So we don't have to work so hard to get our needs met. And when we have moments in life where we stumble or struggle or life happens, the system around us actually helps us in those moments to re-meet our needs, as opposed to like, oh God, we've got even more working against us. Like, it's working against us when we're already struggling, kind of thing. But the most important thing is that ecosystem has to support everybody in getting their needs met in order for it to be sustainable. And in order for it to mean that, based on the interconnectedness of humans, which is one of the principles of the universal needs, and one of the principles of ensuring your needs get met, in order for it to make sure that it actually supports your needs, it has to actually support the needs of others as well, because that interconnectedness means that if other people's needs are being compromised, actually our needs are not being effectively met either, because of our humanity, which is that shared connection. So if we, like, our humanity, like we see somebody else whose needs are not being well supported, that there's an element of, if we believe that's how it should be, then we're dehumanizing them. We dehumanize them, we disconnect from their humanity, and actually in doing so we disconnect from our humanity, which compromises our own needs. So we've talked about this in previous episodes, but I think it's just really important to recognize that we all have a responsibility for changing the system. And if the system doesn't support everybody's needs, it doesn't really support anybody's needs. So we want to make sure that we use whatever capacity we have to be a part of changing that system for our benefit, and especially for the benefit of the people who don't get the benefits of privilege. They're getting the costs of those traumas, and they have less capacity, less energy, and less social power to be able to change them. Like, this benefits us all to do this. So it's really important for us to know about this, recognize it, and name it, which is why I wanted to add it to this episode. Anything you want to add, or any questions? No?
I'm good.
Good. All right. Okay. Well, we're going to call it there then. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We will be back again very soon. Between now and then, remember to stay safe, to take care of yourself, and to continue to meet your own needs. Lots of love. Bye.
Bye, friends.
That's it for today.
If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and give us a written review,
as it will help more people find us. And remember, an important part of healing from trauma is identifying which needs have been negatively impacted and making a conscious, intentional effort to re-meet those needs.
Well, shit. It really is that simple.